Han Hong, replying to Cheng poem called Impromptu on an Autumn Night. Long bamboos leaned in a breeze. The empty city lay quiet in the moonlight. One goose flew across the river of stars. From 1,000 houses came the clatter of washboards. The chill foretold the end of autumn. I slept late, knowing we would meet that night. All night long we chanted your elegant lines, till dawn surprised us with the cries of crows. So this is the first poem by Han Hong included in the anthology out of 3. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction about Han Hong. He is not a very important figure, at least not a very famous figure as far as I'm aware. He is one of a group of poets that are generally grouped as the 10 talents of the Dali era, which were poets that mainly flourished and wrote their best pieces of work in the aftermath of the An Lushan rebellion. And collectively, they're considered, as I say, a group whose style and whose characteristics are a bit of a transition. They represent quite a high technical mastery and craftsmanship in line with the Hai Tang style. But the main criticism that is generally heaped upon them is that they're pretty indistinct and morally and thematically empty. That is, they're very good at technique, but they're rather empty in content. I imagine this idea, especially a result of comparing them with some of the Hai Tang poets, which did write a poetry full of moral Confucian values or Buddhist religious values like Du Fu or Wang Wei, and also contrasting them with the successors of the Dali era poets, which would be the mid-Tang poets, people like Chang Jian or Juan Chen or above all Bai Juji, who wrote a poetry that was, very, very moralistic and Confucian. Now, this group of Dali era poets is relatively well represented in this collection. Apart from Han Hong, we will encounter the main writer in the group soon, which is Lu Lun, and also Sikong Shu is another of the poets of the Dali group that is represented in the anthology. About Han Hong, he was from Nanyang, that is from the relatively northern center region of China, the traditional heartland. And he passed his examinations 1 year before the An Lushan rebellion, and then he mainly served in regional postings. There's a story that Emperor Tedzung, which was the emperor during the Dali era, if I am not mistaken, decided to promote him on the basis of one poem that Han Hong had written that the emperor liked a lot. In fact, it's a poem that is included in this anthology and that we will read in a few days' time, a poem about the Qingming, the Cold Foods Festival. Okay, then, so let's go back to this poem. So the title, replying to Cheng poem called Impromptu on an Autumn Night. So we've talked a lot about the social function of poetry for Tang poets. So writing poetry was was one of the outer indications that the person composing it was a part of the scholar official group and was a scholar official himself. And in the social acts in which scholar officials mingled, one of the main activities that they did was, write poetry, recite poetry, and compose impromptu, spontaneous poetry for the needs of the different celebrations, banquets, farewell parties, or courtly meetings that scholar officials would experience in their life, especially in the capital or in the big cities of the empire. So here we have an answer poem. So somebody who does not appear in the rest of the anthology and whose original poem, I don't know if it has been preserved or lost. Cheng writes a poem. It's an improvisation, and it's based on the topic Autumn Night. And this poem by Han Hong is an answer to that poem. So this was very typical. A poet or a prince, especially of a higher social ranking in a party, composes a poem, and another of the people present composes a poem answering it back. Sometimes these answers were pretty elaborate. So one thing that was especially typical in the Six Dynasties was you made an answer matching the rhymes of the first poem. So the answer poem had to rhyme in exactly the same rhymes and in exactly the same places as the original, and the subject matter was also generally a parallelistic variation of the original piece. Now, I'm not sure here there is a repetition of the rhymes, but I'm pretty sure the ideas and the images that appear in Han Hong's poem are a reflection of those that would have appeared in Cheng Jiang's poem. So what is the topic of the poem? Well, the title clearly states it, Autumn Night. Remember, lots of Chinese poems are about the seasons. The preferred season is autumn, which is generally the sad, melancholy, bittersweet season of the year, when decline amidst beauty, amidst the beautiful moon and the red leaves of the fallen trees, creates this combination of sweet and sour, of sadness, melancholy, and beauty that is so much to the liking of the scholar officials and the classical poetic tradition. So the topic of the poem is autumn. Season is a seasonal topic, the description of an autumn night, the sights, the sounds of an autumn night. And we also have an element of the conviviality or Bacchic nature of a lot of Chinese poems as a sub-theme, because the second part of the poem, the last 4 lines, the last 2 couplets, reflects a scene happening in an autumn night. Now, as it can be interpreted in this version of the poem, it seems to be a night that Han Hong spends with Cheng Jiang or with somebody else, but reciting Cheng Jiang's poems. So there's this descriptive element as a sub-theme of describing the pleasures of enjoying the company of another scholar official and of reciting poetry at night. And spending all the night so infused in the recitation and reading that, time flies and morning catches the guests while reading poetry. But as I said, this is I think this is the interpretation that is warranted in this version of the poem. I've read 2 other translations, and the 2 other translations choose a different interpretation of this poem's ending. They follow a different path. In the other versions, the idea is that the poetic persona, that is Han Hong, is reading the poetry of Cheng Jiang alone, by himself. Whereas in this version, Han Hong is supposed to be reading the poetry with somebody else, possibly Cheng Jiang himself. Okay, then, so as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. Long bamboos leaned in a breeze. The empty city lay quiet in the moonlight. So, as usual, the first couplet of a pentasyllabic regulated poem is usually a background or a background descriptive type of line. So here we get the backdrop in which the autumn night and in which the scene that is going to be developed in the next lines takes place. And they're very visual. So first we have long bamboos leaning in the breeze. Yeah? Long bamboos, they probably have grown in the summer. They might have been small in spring. They grew in summer. Now they're big, they're long. And there's a soft breeze. Breezes are generally associated with autumn as opposed to the stifling heat of the summer. The autumn weather is cooler and more pleasant, as summer in China, in most areas of China and Japan, tends to be very humid and very hot, even the nights. So the bamboos are shaking slightly, and in front of us we have the empty city. It's nighttime, the moonlight is shining, illuminating the scene, but the city is relatively quiet or relatively empty. People are sleeping, most people are asleep. So this is the image, an oniric image of a sleeping and quiet or relatively quiet city and bamboo shaking in the wind. Again, in other interpretations, in 2 other versions of this poem that I read, the first line is interpreted not as bamboos leaning, but as a bamboo mat being refreshed by the breeze. So this creates a completely different image. So instead of having a background of bamboo shaking, you would have a bamboo carpet on top of which the poetic persona is probably sitting while enjoying the pleasures of night time. Next couplet. One goose flew across the river of stars. From 1,000 houses came the clatter of washboards. So the second couplet seems in a way to continue the images of the first couplet. It seems pretty continuistic. So a goose, geese are typical animals that symbolize autumn because they're migrating birds. They both go to and go away from China depending on the season. Basically, I think in spring they come to China, to the south of China, and in autumn they leave. I'm not pretty sure if it's that way or vice versa. But anyway, they move through the season. So geese appear in autumn in many autumn poems. There's a goose crossing heaven, crossing the river of stars. Also, the river of stars is very important in autumn imagery. There's the legend of Tanabata. That's how it's called in Japanese. Seventh day, seventh night of the seventh month, in which two of the heavenly stars meet. They have to spend all the year separated, but in that year they can cross the Milky Way and be together. So a lone goose is crossing the Milky Way. Perhaps the lone goose is meant to represent the lonely poet who is speaking. And from 1,000 homes come the clatter of washboards. The moving geese parallel the leaning bamboos, and now the 1,000 houses with a clatter of washboards parallel the empty city. The parallel is here a bit contrastive. If the city was quiet before, how can it be noisy now? Well, we might imagine it's a later development. So perhaps the city was quiet before, but now noise starts to be heard, or perhaps it's not so high a noise. But it's also a typical image. In the original, the noise that is meant to be evoked, that is the washboards that are clattering, that's women using fulling blocks on wet clothes so that they can better wash them. This is very typical in China, or was typical in China, especially at the time of seasonal change, when the winter clothes, in this case, preparing for autumn, would be washed and dried so that the winter set of clothes could be put on. So there's this echo reverberating in the relatively quiet night, this thumping, thumping, thumping coming from all those women sleepless and washing their own and perhaps their husband's clothes. So again, we still get the background of sound and sight in this autumn night in the big city. Third couplet. The chill foretold the end of autumn. I slept late, knowing we would meet that night. Well, the third couplet is a bit difficult for me to interpret, as I say. So the first line is quite easy. The chill foretold the end of autumn. It's slightly chilly. So autumn nights were fresh, cool, in contrast with the summer nights, but this night is a little bit cooler than usual. So we're probably getting close to autumn. This extra chill, we're getting closer to winter. This extra chill seems to be indicating that it's late in the month, that we're close to winter, late in the season, or perhaps that the sadness, the melancholy sadness that the poetic persona is experiencing because he is alone, because it's autumn, because he is perhaps away from Cheng or from other friends, intensifies the sadness and a feeling of coldness, which makes it feel as if it were later in the season, even if it isn't. And the next line he says, I slept late, knowing we would meet that night. So how I interpret it is, he slept late the night before. That is, the night before the scene that is being described, this night contemplating the city, hearing the sounds. The previous night, Han Hong stayed in bed until late. He wanted to sleep extra because he knew that this night, the night in which the poem is taking place, he would meet with his friend, maybe Cheng Jiang, or maybe somebody else. Remember, this is a poem answering a poem by Cheng Jiang. Perhaps Cheng Jiang's poem had this image of spending a night with another friend, perhaps with Han Hong himself. So Han Hong is saying, yeah, I think he is saying, the previous night I slept till late because I knew tonight we would be together, and I wanted to be really awake to be able to enjoy your company all night long. Another possibility, is he really referring to the physical presence of the friend, or perhaps to his evoked presence if texts, poems from the friend, perhaps Cheng poem itself, is read? So he would be present in the recitation of his words, but he would be absent physically. Well, anyway, all of those could be possible. Finally, the couplet that concludes: all night long we chanted your elegant lines, till dawn surprised us with the cries of crows. So the poem ends, the synthesis is: in this lovely night, slightly sad and melancholy night, the poet seemed to have joined with somebody else, or at least with somebody else's elegant lines, and to have spent all night long reading those poems, reciting those poems, chanting those poems, enjoying them so much that the whole night passed as if in a whisper, as if in a second, and morning came when they were still reading and appreciating poetry. Again, I think, at least in the translation, or at least in how I interpret it, there is an ambiguity. Who spends all night long? So in this translation, there's a pronoun, which seems to point that it's at least two people who are spending the night together reciting poetry. All night long we chanted your elegant lines. So who is we? It's more than one person. Till dawn surprised that. So the image we would get in this version is at least two people, the poetic persona of Han Hong and somebody else, stayed all night reciting the poems, probably the poems of Cheng, or anyway the poems of the person to whom this poem is addressed. And that's it, really. So not a bad poem. And we get this juxtaposed image, as I said, of description of a nice autumn night and description of what would happen in a nice autumn night. It doesn't really matter if it is meant to be a poet alone reading the poetry of another, or a poet with another reading the poems of a third party. The image, which is not really reflected in this translation, of the poetic persona being alone, I think is more evocative, more intense. But however you wish to interpret it, I think it's okay. I would like to take a look at a few other versions of this poem to see how they interpret this.